Chapter 5, the objects of spiritual thoughts, or what they are conversant about, evidencing them in whom they are to be spiritually minded. Before I proceed to the next general head, and which is a principal thing, the foundation of the grace and duty inquired after, some things must be spoken to render what has been already insisted on yet more particularly useful. And this is, to inquire what are or what ought to be the special objects of those thoughts which, under the qualifications laid down, are the evidences of our being spiritually minded. And it may be we may be useful to many in this by helping them to fix their minds, which are apt to rove into all uncertainty, for this has befallen us through the disorder and weakness of the faculties of our souls, that sometimes what the mind guides, leads, and directs to, in things spiritual and heavenly, our wills and affections, through their deprivation and corruption, will not comply with. And so the good designings of the mind are lost. Sometimes what the will and affections are inclined to and ready for, the mind through its weakness and inconstancy cannot lead them to the accomplishment of. So the will is present with us, but how to perform that we know not. So many are barren in this duty because they don't know what to fix upon, nor to how to exercise their thoughts when they have chosen a subject for the meditations. Hence they spend their time in fruitless desires that they could use their thoughts to more purpose, rather than make any progress in the duty itself. They weary themselves, not because they are not willing to go, but because they cannot find their way. Therefore both these things shall be spoken to, both what are the proper objects of our spiritual thoughts and how we may be steady in our contemplation of them. And I shall, to this purpose, first give some general rules and then some particular examples in a way of direction. Number 1, observe the special calls of providence, and apply your minds to thoughts of the duties required in them and by them. There is a voice in all dispensations of providence. The Lord's voice cries to the city, and a man of wisdom shall see thy name. Hear the rod, and who has appointed it, Micah 6, verse 9. There is a call, a cry in every rod of God, in every chastising providence, and in this he makes a declaration of his name, his holiness, his power, his greatness. This every wise, substantial man will labor to discern, and so comply with the call. God is greatly provoked when it is otherwise. Lord, when your hand is lifted up, they will not see, but they shall see and be ashamed. Isaiah 26:11. If, therefore, we would apply ourselves to our present duty, what is the voice of God in his present providential dispensations in the world? Don't hearken to any who would give any other interpretation of them, but that they are plain declarations of his displeasure and indignation against the sins of men. Is not his wrath in them revealed from heaven against all the ungodliness of men, especially such as retain the truth and unrighteousness, or false hypocritical professors of the gospel? Does he not also signally declare the uncertainty and instability of earthly enjoyments, from life itself to a shoe latchet, as also how vain and foolish it is to adhere inordinately to them? The fingers that appeared writing on the wall, the doom of Belshazzar, did it in characters that none could read, and words that none could understand but Daniel. But the present call of God in these things is made plain upon tables, that he may run who reads it. If the heavens gather blackness with clouds, and it thunder over us, if any that are on their journey will not believe that there is a storm coming, they must bear the severity of it. Suppose, then, this to be the voice of providence. Suppose there be in it these indications of the mind and will of God. What are the duties that we are called to by them? They may be referred to two heads. 1, a diligent search into ourselves and a holy watch over ourselves with respect to those ways and sins which the displeasure of God is declared against. That present providences are indications of God's anger and displeasure we take for granted. But when this is done, the most are apt to blame others and to excuse themselves. So long as they see others more wicked and profligate than themselves, openly guilty of such crimes as they abhor the thoughts of, they cast all the wrath on them, and fear nothing but that they shall suffer with them. But alas, when a storm came on the ship at sea, in which there was but one person that feared God, upon an inquiry for whose sake it came, the lot fell on him, Jonah 1 verse 7. The cause of the present storm may as well be the secret sins of professors as the open provocations of ungodly men. God will punish severely those which he has known, Amos 3 verse 2. It is therefore certainly our duty to search diligently that nothing be found resting in us against which God is declaring his displeasure. Take heed of negligence and security in this. When our Savior foretold his disciples that one of them should betray him, he who alone was guilty was the last that said, "Master, is it I?" Let no ground of hopes you have of your spiritual condition and acceptance with God, no sense of your sincerity in any of your duties, no visible difference between you and others in the world, impose themselves on your minds to divert them from diligence in this duty. The Lord's voice cries unto the city, and the man of wisdom will see his name. Number 2, a diligent endeavor to live in a holy resignation of our persons, our lives, our families, all our enjoyments to the sovereign will and wisdom of God, so as that we may be in readiness to part with all things upon his call without repining. This also is plainly declared in the voice of present providences. God is making wings for men's riches. He is shaking their habitations, taking away the visible defenses of their lives, proclaiming the instability and uncertainty of all things here below. And if we are not minded to contend with him, we have nothing left to give us rest and peace for a moment, but a holy resignation of all to his sovereign pleasure. Would you now know what you should fix and exercise your thoughts upon, so as that they may be evidences of your being spiritually minded? I say, be frequently conversant in them about these things. They lie before you, they call upon you, and will find you a just employment. Count them part of your business. Allow them some part of your time. Cease not until you have the testimony of your consciences that you have in sincerity stated both these duties in your minds, which will never be done without many thoughts about them. Unless it be so with you, God will be greatly displeased at the neglect of his coming and call. Now it is so plain and articulate. Fear the woeful dooms recorded in Proverbs 1, verses 24 to 31, Isaiah 65, verse 12, Isaiah 66, verse 4, to this purpose. And if any calamity, public or private, overtake you under a neglect of these duties, you will be woefully surprised, and not know which way to turn for relief. This, therefore, is a time and season in which you may have a special trial and experiment whether you are spiritually minded or not. It is the wisdom of faith to excite and draw forth grace into exercise according to present occasions. If this grace is habitually resident in you, it will put itself forth in many thoughts about these present duties. But alas, for the most part men are apt to walk contrary to God in these things, as the wisdom of the flesh is contrary to him in all things. A great example we have with respect to these duties, especially the latter of them, for who almost makes a diligent search into and trial of his heart and ways with respect to the procuring causes of the displeasure and judgments of God. Generally, when the tokens and evidences of them abound, the world is full of outrageous, provoking sins. These visibly proclaim themselves to be the causes of the coming of the wrath of God on the children of disobedience. Hence, most men are apt to cast a whole reason of present judgments upon them, and to put it wholly from themselves. Hence, commonly, there is never less of self-examination than when it is called for in a peculiar manner. But as I will not deny but that the open, daring sins of the world are the procuring cause of the wrath of God against it in temporal judgments, so the wisest course for us is to refer them to the great judgment of the last day. This the apostle directs us to 2 Thessalonians 1, verses 6 to 10. Our duty is to consider on what account judgment begins at the house of God, and to examine ourselves with respect to this. Again, the other part of our present duty in compliance with the voice of providence is a humble resignation of ourselves and all of our concerns to the will of God, sitting loose in our affections from all earthly temporal enjoyments. This we neither do nor can do. Let us profess what we will, unless our thoughts are greatly exercised about the reasons for it and motives to it. For this is a way in which faith puts forth its power to the mortification of self and all earthly enjoyments. Therefore, without this we can make no resignation of ourselves to the will of God. But alas, how many at present openly walk contrary to God in this? The ways, the countenances, the discourses of men give evidence to it. Their love to present things, their contrivances for their increase and continuance, grow and thrive under the calls of God to the contrary. So it was of old. They ate, they drank, they married wives, they were given in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark. Can the generality of professors at this day give testimony to the exercise of their thoughts upon such things as should dispose them to this holy resignation, that they meditate on the calls of God, and thence make themselves ready to part with all his time and pleasure? How can persons pretend to be spiritually minded, the current of whose thoughts lies in direct contrariety to the mind of God? Here lies the ground of their self-deceivings. They are professors of the gospel in a peculiar manner. They judge themselves believers. They hope they shall be saved and have many evidences for it. But one negative evidence will render 100 that are positive useless. All these things have I done, says the young man. Yet you lack one thing, says the Savior. And the lack of that one rendered his all things of no avail to him. Many things you have done, many things you do, many grounds of hope abide with you. Neither yourselves nor others do doubt of your condition. But are you spiritually minded? If this one thing be lacking, all the rest will not avail you. You have indeed neither life nor peace. And what grounds have you to judge that you are so, if the current of your thoughts lies in direct contrariety to the present calls of God? If at such a time as this, your love to the world be such as ever it was, and perhaps increased, if your desires are strong to secure the things of this life to you and yours, if the daily contrivance of your mind be not how you may attain a constant resignation of yourselves and your all to the will of God, which will not be done without much thoughtfulness and meditations on the reasons of it and motives to it, I cannot understand how you can judge yourselves to be spiritually minded. If any therefore shall say that they would abound more in spiritual thoughts, only they don't know what to fix them upon, I propose this in the first place as that which will lead them to the due performances of present duties. Number 2, the special trials and temptations of men call for the exercise of their thoughts in a peculiar manner with respect to them. If a man has a bodily disease, pain, or distemper, it will cause him to think much of it, whether he will or not. At least if he is wise, he will do so. Nor will he always be complaining of the smart, but he will inquire into the causes and seek their removal. Yet are there some distempers, as lethargies, which in their own nature take away all sense and thoughts of themselves. And some are of such a slow secret progress as hectic fevers that are not taken notice of. But both of these are mortal. And shall men be more negligent about the spiritual distempers of their souls, so as to multiply temptations, the cause of all spiritual diseases, and take no thought about them? Is it not to be feared that where it is so, they are such as either in their own nature have deprived them of spiritual sense, or by their deceitfulness are leading on insensibly to death eternal? Not to have our minds exercised about these things is to be stupidly secure, Proverbs 23, verses 34 and 35. There is, I confess, some difficulty in this matter, how to exercise our thoughts aright about our temptations, For the great way of the prevalency of temptations is by stirring up multiplied thoughts about their objects, or what they lead to. And this is done or occasioned several ways. First, from the previous power of lust in the affections. This will fill the mind with thoughts. The heart will coin imaginations in compliance with it. They are the way and means in which lust draws away the heart from duty and entices to sin, James 1 verse 14. The means, at least, in which men come to have eyes full of adultery, 2 Peter 2:14, or to live in constant contemplation of the pleasures of sin. Secondly, they arise and are occasioned by renewed representation of the object of sin. And this is twofold. That which is real, as Achan saw the wedge of gold and coveted it, Joshua 7:21, Proverbs 23:31. Against this is that prayer of the psalmist, turn away mine eyes from beholding vanity, in the covenant of Job, chapter 31, verse 1. Number 2, imaginary. When the imagination being tainted or infected by lust continually represents the pleasures of sin and the actings of it to the mind. In this men make provision for the flesh to fulfill the lusts of it, Romans 13:16. Also from the suggestions of Satan, who uses all his wiles and artifices to stir up thoughts about that sin in which the temptation leads. And temptation seldom fails of its end when it can stir up a multitude of unprofitable thoughts about its object. For when temptations multiply thoughts about sin, proceeding from some or all of these causes, and the mind has wanted itself to give them entertainment, those in whom they are lack nothing but opportunities and occasions, taken off the power of outward restraints for the commission of actual sin. When men have so devised mischief, they practice it, when it is in the power of their hand, Micah 2 verse 1. It is no way safe to advise such persons to have many thoughts about their temptations. They will all turn to their disadvantage. I speak to them only, to whom their temptations are their affliction and their burden. And such persons also must be careful how they allow their thoughts to be exercised about the manner of their temptation, lest it be a snare and be too hard for them. Men may begin their thoughts of any object with abhorrency and detestation, and if it be a case of temptation in them in complacency and approbation. The deceitfulness of sin lays hold on something or other that lust in the mind stays upon with delectation. That word means pleasure and delight, and so corrupts the whole frame of spirit which began the duty. There have been instances in which persons have entered with the resolution to punish sin, and have been ensnared by the occasion to the commission of the sin they sought to punish. Therefore, it is seldom that the mind of anyone exercised with a natural temptation is able safely to conflict with it, if it entertain abiding thoughts of the manner of it, or of the sin in which it leads. For sin has an ability to transfuse its poison into the affections from everything it has once made a bait of, especially if it have already defiled the mind with pleasing contemplations of it. Yet oftentimes a man that has some spiritual strength, and in it engages to the performance of duties, if in the midst of them the manner of his temptation is so presented to him as to take hold of his thoughts in a moment, as if he had seen, as they say, Medusa's head is turned into a stone, his spirits are all frozen, his strength is gone, all actings of grace cease, his armor falls from him, and he gives up himself a prey to his temptation. It must be a new supply of grace that can give him any deliverance. Therefore, while persons are exercised with any temptation, I do not advise them to be conversant in their thoughts about the manner of it. For sometimes remembrances of former satisfaction of their lusts sometimes surprises them with the suitableness of it to corruption not yet mortified. Sometimes the craft of Satan fixing their imagination on it will be too hard for them, and carry them to a fresh compliance with that sin which they would be delivered from. But this season calls in a special manner for the exercise of the thoughts of men about the ways and means of deliverance from the snare in which they are taken. or the danger they find themselves exposed to. Think of the guilt of sin, that you may be humbled. Think of the power of sin, that you may seek strength against it. Don't think of the manner of sin, the things that are in the world suited to the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, lest you be more and more entangled by it. But the present direction is, think much of the ways of relief from the power of your own temptation leading you to sin. But this men, unless they are spiritually minded, are very loath to come to. I don't speak of them that love their shackles, that glory in their yoke, that like their temptations well enough as those which give the most satisfactory entertainment to their minds. Such men know not well what to do unless they may in their minds converse with the objects of their lusts, and multiply thoughts about them continually. The apostle calls it making provision for the flesh to fulfill the lusts of it. Their principal trouble is that they cannot comply with them to the utmost, by reason of some outward restraints. These dwell near to those fools who make a mock of sin, and will ere long take up their habitation among them. But I speak, as I said before, of them only whose temptations are their afflictions, and who groan for deliverance from them. Acquaint such persons with the great, indeed only way of relief in this distress, as it is expressed in Hebrews 2, verses 17 and 18. He is a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God. For in that he himself has suffered being tempted, he is able to succor them that are tempted. In chapter 4, verses 15 and 16. We have not an high priest that cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Let them know that the only way for their deliverance is by acting faith and thoughts on Christ, his power to succor them that are tempted, with the ways in which he administers the sufficiency of grace to that end, retreating for relief to him on the urgency of temptations. They can hardly be brought to a compliance therewith. They are ready to say, are not Abana and Pharpar, rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Is it not better to betake ourselves and to trust to our own promises, resolutions, and endeavors, with such other ways of escape as are in our own power? I shall speak nothing against any of them in their proper place, so far as they are warranted by scriptural rule. But this I say, none shall ever be delivered from perplexing temptations to the glory of God and their own spiritual advantage, but by the acting and exercising of faith on Christ Jesus, and the sufficiency of his grace for our deliverance. But when men are not spiritually minded, they cannot fix their thoughts on spiritual things. Therefore do men daily pine away under their temptations. They get ground upon them until their breach grows great like the sea, and there is no healing of it. I mention this only to show the weight and necessity of the duty proposed. For when men under the power of conviction are pressed with temptation, they will do anything rather than betake themselves to the only efficacious relief. Some will groan and cry out under their vexation from the torture they are put into in the conflict between their temptations and convictions. Some will betake themselves to the pretended relief that any false religion tenders to them, but to apply themselves in thoughts of faith to Jesus Christ, whose grace alone is sufficient for all, they will not be persuaded to this. We are all of us liable to temptations. Those who are not sensible of it are under the power of what the temptation leads to. And they are of two sorts. First, such as are extraordinary, when the hand of God is in them, in a peculiar manner for our rebuke. It is true, God tempts none, as temptation formerly leads to sin, but he orders temptation so far forth as they are afflictive in chastisements. So it is when he allows a special corruption within to fall in conjunction with a special temptation without, and to become prevalent by this. Of these there is no doubt, but any man not judicially hardened may know both his disease and the remedy. But that ordinary course of temptations which we are exercised with needs a diligent attendance for their discovery, as well as for our deliverance from them. And it is to be feared that many are kept in spiritual weakness, useless, and in darkness all their day through the power of their temptations, yet never know what they are or in what they consist. These gray hairs are sprinkled on them, yet they know it not. Some approve themselves in those very things and ways which are their temptations. Yet in the exercise of due watchfulness, diligence, and prudence, men may know both the plague of their own hearts and their prevailing corruptions, and the ways in which it is excited through temptation, with the occasions it makes use of and the advantages it takes. For example, one may have an eminency in gifts and usefulness or success in his labors, which give him great acceptance with others. Such an one shall hardly avoid a double temptation, first, a spiritual pride, and self-exaltation. So the apostle will not admit a novice, one unexperienced in the ways of grace and deceits of sin, into the office of the ministry, lest he should be lifted up with pride and fall into the condemnation of the devil, 1 Timothy 3:6. He himself was not without danger of this, 2 Corinthians 12, 1-7. The best of men can hardly fortify their minds against the secret workings of pride upon successes and applause, unless they keep themselves constantly balanced with thoughts of their own vileness in the sight of God. And secondly, remissness to exact universal mortification, which they countenance themselves against by their acceptance and success above others in the ministry. It were much to be desired that all who are ministered would be careful in these things. For although some of us may not much please others, yet we may so far please ourselves as to expose our souls to these snares. And the effects of negligence in this openly appear to the disadvantage of the gospel. Others are much conversant in the world and the affairs of it. Negligence is to a spiritual watch. Vanity and converse, love of earthly things with conformity to the world, will on all occasions impose themselves upon them. If they understand not their temptations in this, spiritual mindedness will be impaired in them continually. Those that are rich have their special temptations, which for the most part are many plausible and effectual, and those that are poor have theirs also. The snares of some lie in their constitutions, of others in their society, of most in the various circumstances of life. Those who are upon their watch in any due measure, who exercise any wisdom or observation concerning themselves, may know in what their temptations lie. What are the advantages in which they perplex their minds and endanger their souls? In these cases, generally men are taught what are the ways and means of their deliverance and preservation. Therefore, there are three things required to this duty and spiritual wisdom to them all: to know what are the special temptations from whence you suffer, and by which the life of God is obstructed in you. If this is neglected, if it is disregarded, no man can maintain either life or peace or is spiritually minded. Secondly, to know your remedy, your belief, in which alone it consists. Many duties are required of us to this end, and are useful thereunto. But know assuredly that no one of them, not all of them in conjunction, will bring in relief to the glory of God and your own peace, without application by faith to him who is able to succor them that are tempted. Therefore, number 3, in this lies your great duty with respect to your temptations, namely in a constant exercise of your thoughts on the love, care, compassion, and tenderness of Christ, with his ability to help, succor, and save them that believe, so as to strengthen your faith and trust in him, which will assuredly prove successful and victorious. The same duty is incumbent on us with respect to any urgent, prevalent, general temptation. There are seasons in which an hour of temptation comes on the earth to try them that dwell on it. What if a man should judge that now it is such an hour, and that the power of darkness is put forth? What if he should be persuaded that a general security, coldness, deadness, and decay in grace, especially as to the vigorous actings of zeal, love, and delight in God, with an indifference to holy duties, are the effects of this hour of temptation? I do not say determinately that so it is. Let others judge as they see cause. But if anyone does so judge, undoubtedly it is his duty to be exercised in his thoughts, how he may escape in this day of trial, and be counted worthy to stand before the Son of Man. He will find it his concern to be conversant in his mind with the reasons and motives to watchfulness, and how he may obtain such supplies of grace as may effectually preserve him from such decays. Number 3, all things in religion, both in faith and practice, are to be the objects of such thoughts, as they are proposed or occur in our minds in great variety on all sorts of occasions, so we ought to give them entertainment in our meditations, to hear things, to have them proposed to us, it may be in a way of divine ordinance, and to let them slip out or flow from us as water that is poured into a leaking vessel is a ruin of many souls. I shall therefore choose out some examples, as was before proposed, of those things which I judge that they who would be spiritually minded ought to abide and abound in thoughts concerning.